Last New Year's Eve, I was working late. I'm a cleaner for a small office building downtown, and while most people were out celebrating, I had a few more hours of work before I could go home. The building was empty by 8 p.m., leaving just me and my mop bucket, trudging through the hallways. The building was old, its age masked by modern renovations. But when you were alone in it, especially at night, you could feel its history. The occasional creak of the floors, the groan of the heating system. It all added to the uneasy atmosphere. Still, I was used to it. Around 10:30 p.m., I finished cleaning the third floor and decided to take a quick break in the small lounge on the second floor. The lounge had a few vending machines, a couch, and a window overlooking the city. I grabbed a coffee from the machine and sat by the window, watching the streets below. That's when I noticed it. Across the street, in the reflection of the building opposite ours, I saw movement. A shadow in one of the windows on the third floor, the same floor I had just cleaned. I froze, my coffee cooling in my hands. The shadow moved slowly, almost lazily, as if it didn't care about being seen. It passed from one window to the next, pausing briefly each time. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a trick of the light, or someone from another office coming back to grab something they'd forgotten. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept up my spine. After a few minutes, I forced myself to go back upstairs. The third floor was silent, the lights still on from when I'd left. The air felt colder than it should have, and I noticed faint smudges on the polished floor, like footprints, but distorted, almost smeared. I followed them down the hallway, my shoes squeaking softly on the tiles. The footprints led to the end of the corridor, where the largest meeting room was located. The door was ajar, the faint glow of the city lights seeping through the blinds. I pushed the door open slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The room was empty, except for a single chair in the center. It was one of those heavy, high-backed chairs, and it had been turned to face the corner, like someone had been sitting there, staring at the wall. I didn't remember leaving it like that. I turned the chair back toward the table, trying to dismiss the growing sense of dread. But as I stepped back into the hallway, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from further down the corridor, near the storage room. My first instinct was to leave, but something compelled me to check. Maybe I thought it was just a loose pipe or a faulty vent. I didn't want to be the person who panicked over nothing. The storage room door was shut. I pressed my ear against it, straining to hear. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, almost like Morse code. I opened the door. The room was pitch black. The light switch was just inside, so I reached for it, my fingers fumbling in the dark. As soon as the light flickered on, the tapping stopped. The room was empty, just shelves of cleaning supplies and a mop bucket in the corner. But then, I noticed something chilling. Written on the floor in long, wet streaks were the words, "Why did you leave?" I stumbled backward, slamming the door shut. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. I ran back to the elevator, desperate to leave the building. As I waited for the elevator to arrive, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, echoing in the empty hallway. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The elevator doors finally opened, and I stepped inside, jabbing the button for the lobby. The doors began to close, but just before they did, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the polished steel. It was a figure standing at the end of the hallway, pale, with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched unnaturally wide. The doors closed, and the elevator began its descent. When I reached the lobby, I ran straight to my car and didn't look back. I called my supervisor the next day and quit on the spot. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't want to know. But every New Year's Eve, I think about that figure, about the tapping, the chair, the words scrawled on the floor. And I wonder if, wherever it is, it's still waiting for me to come back. Last New Year's Eve, I was driving back from my parents' house. They live in a small, rural town, and I had stayed with them for the holidays. But with New Year's approaching, I wanted to spend the evening back in the city, alone. I had no plans, and honestly, that suited me. After a busy week of family gatherings, I was looking forward to some quiet. It was around 9 p.m. when I set out. The drive was about 3 hours, and most of it was along a long, winding highway that cut through dense forest. It was a cold, clear night, and the moonlight illuminated the snow-covered landscape. About halfway through the drive, my car radio started to cut out. At first, it was just static, but then it switched to what sounded like a faint voice, a woman's voice. She was speaking softly, almost like she was whispering directly into my ear. I turned the radio off, thinking it was just a bad signal. But as I kept driving, I started to feel uneasy. The road was completely deserted, not another car in sight. The only sound was the hum of my engine and the faint crunch of snow beneath my tires. It was then that I saw the figure. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, standing at the edge of the woods. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person. They were standing on the shoulder of the road, facing the trees, their back to me. I slowed down instinctively, unsure of what to do. It was freezing outside, and they weren't wearing a coat, just a thin dress that fluttered slightly in the breeze. I rolled down my window a crack. "Are you okay?" I called out. My voice sounded too loud in the stillness. The figure didn't move. I was about to drive off when they suddenly turned around. It was a woman. Her skin was pale, almost bluish, and her hair hung in wet strands around her face. But what struck me most were her eyes, wide, unblinking, and completely black. No whites, no pupils, just darkness. She stared at me for what felt like an eternity. Then she smiled, revealing teeth that were jagged and too sharp, like shards of broken glass. I slammed on the gas and sped away, my hands trembling on the wheel. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the road behind me was empty. For a while, I convinced myself that I'd imagined it. Maybe it was the fatigue from driving, or maybe I'd mistaken a shadow for something more sinister. But the feeling of unease stayed with me, and I couldn't shake the image of her face. About 20 minutes later, I passed a small gas station, the first sign of civilization I'd seen in miles. The lights were on, and there was a single car parked outside. Grateful for the chance to calm my nerves, I pulled in. The station was empty, except for the clerk behind the counter. He was an older man with a grizzled beard, reading a newspaper. He looked up as I entered, his expression neutral. "Cold night," he said. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Have you seen anyone on the road tonight? A woman, maybe?" The clerk frowned. "Not tonight. You're the first car I've seen in hours." I nodded and bought a coffee, eager to leave. As I turned to go, he stopped me. "You be careful out there," he said, his tone serious. "This stretch of road, it's got its stories." I didn't ask him to elaborate. I didn't want to know. I got back in my car and continued driving, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The coffee helped steady my nerves, but the road seemed darker now, the trees pressing in closer. I was almost to the city when I saw her again. This time, she was standing in the middle of the road, directly in my path. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the icy pavement. My car came to a stop just a few feet from her. She tilted her head to the side, as if studying me, and then she raised her hand. She pointed toward the woods. I don't know why, but I couldn't look away. It was as if her gaze had pinned me in place, and for a moment, I felt the overwhelming urge to follow her, to step out of my car and walk into the forest, where the shadows were deepest. But then she screamed. The sound was inhuman, a high-pitched wail that rattled my bones. It snapped me out of whatever trance I was in, and I hit the gas, swerving around her and speeding down the road. I didn't stop until I reached the city, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. When I finally parked outside my apartment, I sat in the car for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. The next day, I looked up the area where I'd seen her. What I found still haunts me. Years ago, a woman had gone missing on that stretch of road. She was last seen walking into the woods after her car broke down. Her body was never found. I don't drive that route anymore. And every New Year's Eve, I make sure I'm somewhere far from the woods and from whatever still walks those roads at night. Last New Year's Eve started like any other celebration. I was full of excitement, looking forward to the countdown and fireworks. My friends and I had decided to ring in the new year at a cabin in the woods, a secluded spot we had rented for the occasion. The idea was to escape the city noise, enjoy a cozy night by the fireplace, and make some unforgettable memories. But the memories we made that night turned out to be the kind I wished I could forget. We arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The forest around us was dense, the towering trees casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. The air was crisp, almost biting, but there was a certain charm in the stillness of the place. The cabin itself was quaint, rustic, with wooden beams and a stone fireplace that dominated the living room. It felt like stepping back in time, a perfect escape from modern distractions. By the time we unpacked, the stars were already shining brilliantly overhead. One of my friends suggested we go outside to admire the night sky before starting dinner. As we stood in the clearing behind the cabin, I felt an odd sensation, like we were being watched. It wasn't uncommon for me to feel jittery in unfamiliar places, so I brushed it off, blaming the eeriness on the isolation. But when I mentioned it jokingly, the others laughed it off, saying I had been watching too many horror movies. The evening carried on, and soon we were laughing and toasting with glasses of wine. The warmth of the fire was comforting, and the smell of roasting marshmallows filled the air. Midnight was approaching, and the anticipation of the countdown had everyone in high spirits. That's when things started to change. It began with a loud, distant sound, a metallic screech that echoed through the forest. It was so out of place that we all froze, exchanging nervous glances. One of my friends tried to lighten the mood, suggesting it was probably just a car on a nearby road. But we all knew there weren't any roads for miles. We decided to ignore it, convincing ourselves it was nothing. But as the minutes ticked by, strange noises began to fill the silence. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and what sounded like faint whispers. It felt as though the forest was alive, encircling us, closing in. Someone suggested locking the doors, and though we laughed at the absurdity, we did it anyway. By now, the atmosphere had shifted. The laughter and excitement from earlier were replaced with unease. When midnight finally arrived, we half-heartedly counted down to the new year, our voices trembling with nervous energy. Then, just as we shouted, "Happy New Year," the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, and for a moment, no one moved. The only sounds were our breathing and the crackling of the dying fire. One of my friends pulled out their phone to use as a flashlight, but even the dim light felt inadequate against the pressing darkness. That's when we heard it, a knock at the door. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but it was deliberate. 3 slow, measured knocks. We froze, staring at each other in disbelief. Who could possibly be out here, in the middle of nowhere, on New Year's Eve? One of my friends, braver than the rest of us, approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice quivering. There was no response. The knocking came again, this time louder. It was as if whoever, or whatever, was outside wanted to make it clear they weren't going away. Against our better judgment, we decided to open the door. We thought maybe it was a lost hiker, or someone who genuinely needed help. But when we swung the door open, there was no one there. The clearing outside was empty, the forest silent once more. The only thing out of place was a strange symbol etched into the wood of the door, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward. None of us had seen it before. That night, none of us slept. The power never came back on, and the noises outside continued sporadically. By morning, we were ready to leave, our nerves frayed and our minds racing with unanswered questions. As we drove away from the cabin, I glanced back one last time. Standing at the edge of the forest was a figure, tall, shadowy, and motionless. It didn't follow us, but its presence was enough to make my blood run cold. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. We've tried to rationalize it, to find some logical explanation, but nothing fits. All I know is that last New Year's Eve was the most terrifying experience of my life, and I haven't been back to the woods since.